I've actually lost a lot of friends trying to talk about what happened on 9/11. A lot of them say that they hate conspiracy theories and they don't want to hear it. And I hear you. I hate conspiracy theories too. And that's really why I made this video, because I feel like the 9/11 official story is the conspiracy theory.
We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Dr. Judy Wood earned a PhD degree from Virginia Tech and is a former professor of mechanical engineering. She has research expertise in experimental stress analysis, structural mechanics, deformation analysis, materials characterization, and materials engineering science. Her research has involved testing materials, including complex material systems in the area of photomechanics, or the use of optical and image analysis methods to determine physical properties of materials and measure how materials respond to forces placed on them. She taught graduate and undergraduate engineering classes and has co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed papers and journal publications in her areas of expertise. Dr. Wood has conducted a comprehensive forensic investigation of what physically happened to the World Trade Center site on 9/11. And based on her analysis of the evidence she gathered in 2007, she filed a federal qui tam case for science fraud against the contractors who contributed to the official National Institute of Standards and Technology report.
The moment I decided to do that, I sort of said something to my students. I said, if you knew the world was going to end in a week, and it was very little chance you could save it, would you try?
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
One of the main things that can be observed if you study the videos from the day is what Dr. Judy Wood has called dustification. And this is where you can actually see a significant proportion of the material of which the buildings were made up turning to dust.
So what we're going to learn is that the towers didn't burn up, nor did they slam to the ground, but turned into dust in midair. That's not a collapse, that's dust squirting up. Look at these beams falling with dust trailing behind them, opaque dust. It initially blocked out all of the sunlight, 100% of the sunlight, so it was pitch black. It's very dense dust. And you come to the realization that these pieces of material are becoming dust. They're frothing up into dust as they fall. And they didn't hit the ground. If they had slammed to the ground, there'd be over 1 million tons of debris left stacked up in the ground. That didn't happen. Manhattan would have been flooded. Well, as we'll see, the towers were built in the Hudson River with a dike around them. If you slam 1 million tons of debris down onto the dike, you're going to break it. Didn't happen. And if you slammed 1 million tons of debris to the ground, it's going to make a thud. The seismic signals did not reflect that. Michael Ober said, I don't remember the sound of the building hitting the ground. Somebody told me it was measured on the Richter scale. I don't know how true that is. If the building's hitting the ground that hard, why do I not remember the sound of it?
If every floor were to pancake in line with the official model of the collapse, then the time required would be approximately 100 seconds, not the almost free-fall collapse rate of around 10 seconds that we all saw with our own eyes. Surprisingly, there was little collateral damage to nearby buildings that were not targeted. Although every building with a WTC prefix had to be torn down because they were damaged beyond repair.
You realize those dust particles were smaller than anything that's been seen with like fires or with pulverization.
I've got a shortened version of my talk, why the NIST World Trade Center reports are false. Basically, it's about why they're false and unscientific. So today I will discuss evidence related to the official investigations conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, whose reports comprise the final official explanation for what happened at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Before we get to the reports, however, Let me mention that the first pertinent point to consider is the low probability that the only 3 instances of a skyscraper suffering global collapse due to fire occurred all on the same day in the same place. There have been many raging building fires, much worse than existed in any of the World Trade Center buildings, but no global collapse has ever resulted from those fires. We can see from these photos that the towers appeared to have exploded, starting at the top and then going all the way down. At the top of each tower, the debris appeared to shoot upward and outward, as much of the solid structure turned to dust. This is counterintuitive to the idea that the building was being crushed downward. Many of us have asked ourselves, is this what it looks like when a building is softened or weakened from fire?
At the beginning of its final destruction, World Trade Center 2 tips or twists to the east, but turns to dust before hitting the ground. The tipping top falsifies the claims by NIST that it was an inevitable collapse. If the leaning top had fallen as a rigid block, it would have landed on World Trade Center 4. When we look, it is not there. Not only is it not there, but neither is the main body of World Trade Center 4 itself. In this video, we can see that some of the core columns survive the rest of the building being peeled away from it like a banana, but then these core columns themselves turn to dust before our eyes.
Stephanopoulos is down in Lower Manhattan today. George, I don't know if you heard a little earlier me raise this question, which was actually raised by ABC's Jackie Judd as we look at these areas down below. When you look at where the towers used to stand, there is surprisingly so little rubble. Where did all the rubble go?
It's a very good question, Peter, and I have asked some people who've been doing some of the rescue and recovery work this morning. If you look behind me, you can see the very remains, the skeletal remains of the World Trade Center. And one volunteer, Robert Gerlinski, explained to me the reason there's so little rubble is that all of it simply fell down into the ground and was pulverized, evaporated.
Where did the towers go? That's the title of your book. Where did the towers go?
Actually, it was that conversation between Peter Jennings and George Stephanopoulos that inspired this title. You know, where is all the rubble? Where did it go? Mm-hmm. And I was eager that day, like, you know, yeah, I'm glad somebody's asking that. So we have this image of before and after. The little, you know, yellow box on the bottom mm-hmm. corner is all that's left mm-hmm. of the buildings. We've got to remember what used to be there. Mm-hmm. These huge buildings, and you know they're gone, and just this little stub of a part of a building is all that's left.
I love these graphics created by Adam Dwyer because they give you a real sense of how much of the building actually went missing. Here's a shot of World Trade Center 1 rubble, and in the background we can see Building 7 still frothing up into dust. So we know it was before 5:20 p.m. that day. So the story that they shipped all that steel off to China just doesn't make sense. They were doing a bucket brigade for a while there, just moving stuff with buckets because they didn't want to, you know, hurt any of the potential survivors under the rubble. In the book Report from Ground Zero, Assistant Chief Firefighter Harry Myers says, "I never saw a file cabinet, never saw a desk, a chair, never saw a telephone, never saw any type of office furniture. There's no glass, it just disappeared and has become part of this fluffy white or gray dust." They actually only found one filing cabinet, if you can believe that, and it didn't even look like a filing cabinet. It was melted down to about the size of a basketball, but miraculously, it still had unburnt file folders and money inside of it that they were able to return to Ben & Jerry's.
Now, this is a really bizarre artifact. It's a Bible artifact that's in the 9/11 museum. The Pope even came to visit this item. Folks often like to point out that formerly molten metal that was on the page, it wasn't molten because it was hot. The pages would have burned up.
Sure.
It was liquid metal because of another reason. This is the elevation map of what was left. Here's what should have been there before. And right here, people survived in that little hump at the bottom of Building 3. The rest of Building 3 was gone.
So 16 people actually survived inside the collapse of the North Tower, and they were in stairwell B in the center of the building.
I rolled to a corner and basically went into a fetal position and just waited for the end.
My helmet started flying off my head. I had forgotten to snap my helmet. So I grabbed my helmet. I guess instinctually, I just pulled myself down into the corner.
The collapse of the North Tower created a massive rush of air.
I was blown down 6 stories down to the first floor, and all I could remember while I was being blown down was, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. There wasn't any time to think about anything.
The 110-story tower disintegrated in just 10 seconds.
It was that fast, yet for me it was kind of slow motion too at the same time. And I remember thinking to myself, I said, oh shit, this is it, we didn't make it.
Okay, 10-4, North Tower, stairwell B is in boy on the 2nd floor.
The location given by Jay Jonas was unbelievable to the firefighters listening. The North Tower no longer existed. They asked for his location again.
He asked me that a couple times, and one time he asked me that. Somebody else got on the radio and said, "Where's the North Tower?"
We saw nothing we could recognize in the fields. We expected to see chairs and file cabinets and what was left of offices. Everything was reduced to the finest state. It basically looked like mountains of dirt.
This dome of this 44-story building was right across the street from Tower 1.
It's not even touched.
Right, it's not clobbered.
There's nothing on it.
Right. Building 7 went away that afternoon, and over by the post office, you can see it didn't even spill completely across the street.
One of the key pieces of evidence which shows that this is what happened, that the buildings did indeed turn to dust before they hit the ground, or mostly to dust, is the seismic evidence.
Up above at the top, there's WTC-1's impact on the ground. And what's below that, that blue data, that was an earthquake that was in Midtown Manhattan that same year. It's approximately the same magnitude. And it was a 2.4 instead of a 2.3. But you notice the signals are very, very different. Notice the high frequency of in the blue signal.
Yes.
But notice that you first get the primary wave arriving, that little, it's kind of like snout leading up to the big wave. And then the secondary wave is that bigger one. But you can't see those same signals from when the towers hit. If the towers are slamming down into the bedrock, they should be ringing like a tuning fork.
Right.
Here's the signal for the Tower 1. It lasted 8 seconds. It takes 9.5 seconds to throw a bowling ball off the roof and have it hit the ground below. The building went away faster than it could have fallen. It didn't hit the ground, didn't slam to the ground. That's why there's no S and P waves. There's only surface waves. And that's what you would get if you lifted the building off the ground. You know, think of 2 people sleeping together in the same bed. One person gets up, the other person, in a conventional mattress, the other person feels the disturbance.
Right.
If you lift a 500,000-ton building off the ground, it's going to cause a surface disturbance.
Right.
That's all that was recorded, not anything going boom on the bedrock.
This is the King Dome. So here's a controlled demolition, and it produces a P wave and an S wave. So if we have Seattle King Dome, we're going to look at things relative to that. That made a 2.3 on the Richter scale when it was blown up by controlled demolition. And we have these 2 towers. Let's say for the Tower 2 was the first to go. So if we turn it to dust, all but the bottom 16 stories, and then drop a 16-story building to the ground, we record approximately the same seismic signal as what was recorded on 9/11. Just pretend this rest doesn't exist. And for Tower 2, if you turn it into dust above the 20th story and just drop a 20-story building to the ground, You get the seismic signal that was recorded. And for Building 7, it's all but the bottom 2.5 stories. Where's the rest of the building?
WTC2 just went away at the top, and then WTC1, and then you have these various quarry blasts all day. And then see down here at the bottom, that was an earthquake in the Fox Islands, which is up part of the Aleutian Islands. But look at the thing just before then. That was Building 7 going away. You can't even see it on the chart. It made a 0.6 equivalency on the Richter scale, which is like a jackhammer. And it was 6 times the mass of the King Dome. No wave traveled through the earth. It was only surface waves. That doesn't happen in building demolitions. You know, you always have an S wave and a P wave with building demolitions.
No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires. We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse. And in fact, we have shown for the first time that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
The buckled column caused additional collapsed floors and falling debris that removed support from adjacent interior columns. A chain reaction then caused other interior columns to fail in quick succession. The outside shell of the building fell.
And our analysis showed that even the smallest explosive charge that was capable of bringing down the critical column in the building, had it occurred, we would have seen sound levels of 120 to 130 decibels about a half a mile away. That would have been an incredibly loud sound, and that sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to. Having a collapse of this nature is a very rare event.
To reiterate, the official story of the collapse of Building 7 is that a typical office fire caused this 47-story building to fall in a matter of seconds. If we were to accept this NIST World Trade Center Building 7 report, we would have to conclude that no tall buildings are safe from the possibility of total unexpected collapse due to office fires.
It was turning to dust throughout the day, internally. And you saw an enormous amount of material pouring out of the building, one face and one face only for most of the day. And when it went away, it didn't make a seismic signal that traveled through the earth. It only left a surface wave. It did not slam to the earth. And the surface wave that it left was almost a non-existent event.
When you look at these fires, a lot of smoke. You know, they say where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, that's just because that's all we know. Take things like the microwave. Do we really understand what a microwave does? We just know that it heats our food, but it doesn't heat the paper. Why doesn't it heat the paper? Again, why is there all the paper on the ground?
Neither thermal energy nor kinetic energy can account for the events of 9/11. Only directed energy could leave all the paper and plastic ID cards unscathed while turning steel, concrete, and office furnishings to an ultra-fine dust.
The whole theory that the thing pancaked, came down on itself, crushed itself, I don't see any signs of crushing. And when I say that, the wheat checks, and the wheat checks are the pieces, they almost look like a hashtag. Everybody knows what a hashtag looks like, right? They almost look like that, but what they are is they're made out of box steel, so they're hollow. And they're box steel that's welded together to look like that hashtag, and at the ends of them, there's 4 holes in the top, and they bolt to the next one that comes down. So these things are just all bolted together. The thing that really has got my attention when I seen that is at the end of these beams are perfect. The 4 bolts are gone. Now remember, these beams are made out of steel, and the bolts that are holding together are made out of hardened steel. So they're probably 5, maybe 10 times as hard as the steel they're holding together. And normally, that's the last thing to go. So if this building actually did collapse or fall upon itself or something, those wheat checks, those ends would be ripped apart. Those bolts would still be there holding the pieces of the flange together, but what those flanges are welded to should be ripped. I don't see any signs. What I see is perfectly square ends of those wheat checks. Even if they rip the bolts through, those holes would be all elongated, torn, that whole end would be ripped out. It's just perfect holes without these hardened bolts. You know, as a mechanic, I've been, I bolt frames together, you extend chassis, you make sure you use hardened bolts, hardened washers, and when you see things fail, the bolts are still there. They're the last thing to let go because they're hard. They're made to hang on. So there's no signs of pancaking. You look at the pictures, you look at like the cover there, there's a better one over there even on this book. You look at the cascading coming down. That's not pancaking. To me it's cascading. If everything was supposed to be pancaking, you wouldn't see beautiful, that corner of the outer shell of those wheat checks hanging there with, oh, another piece fell off. How do they fall off? How did that one piece come out of that wheat check with all those hardened bolts on it and not show any signs of stress? There's no signs of stress on most of the metal. You look at those wheat checks, every one of them, whether it's stuck in a building across the road, which some of them did, like these things travel distance. And you could see some of them that were falling were turning to dust in midair. People go, well, that's just dust on them. I'm going, well, you'd have to have dust 3 feet thick on each floor to the amount of dust. Not even in the concrete that's in there is going to create that amount of dust. So I'm looking at this picture and I see a lot of stuff in here. Street light with the wires still intact, all the signs on it. You got another street light, it's just a street light with a mile-per-hour sign on it, and you have more of them over here. 210-story buildings just came down, there they are, and that survived somehow. And the ends of these beams, if you look at each wheat check, it's like they come unbolted. You look at them, none of them are half ripped or half torn. They completely, perfectly come unbolted. You look at the evidence. This is like failure analysis. You look at it and go, okay, what does the evidence say? The evidence saying that this thing come apart. It didn't get crushed. These aren't crushed. Nothing's crushed here.
It's important to realize that the towers were designed for airliner impacts. John Skilling, the structural engineer in charge, said that in the event of an airliner impact, quote, the building structure would still be there.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
Toasted cars, we got to get to the toasted cars. I say they're toast, they're history. I can't say they're burnt because I don't know that, but they're toast. I just decided to use that word to say something happened, messed them up. You can't fix it, you got to get a new one. But this one is quite interesting in that it has an abrupt, toasted, not toasted. Like it's like it's on the showroom floor. It just had a new wax job back there. What abruptly stops? A real fire, a regular fire, doesn't do that. It would be lapping around the corner. Also, why aren't the lights melted?
I didn't hear of any fireballs rolling down the streets, and cars were going into spontaneous combustion. There was no fireball that hit them. They just simply burst into flames for one reason or another. There was even a car park blocks away that the cars started smoking and catching fire, and no one questioned that.
Various detractors like to say that the cars got towed. I don't know about how some of them were, but I know these were not towed. You can see them before and after. And you can see cars adjacent to each other. One might be okay, and the other one isn't.
The other one's fine.
There are witness accounts of what happened to some of these cars too. For example, Patricia Ondrovich, who was a first responder, she, I think, came out of World Trade Center 7, and the cars were exploding right next to her.
The FDNY vehicles were remarkable. There were enormous ladder trucks, pumpers that looked like they were thrown around the fields like toys, and they reeked of unimaginable loss.
If your hand's on a stove burner, it's red hot stove burner, you don't stop and think about it. That hand's off of there. Mm-hmm. It's reflex.
Right.
So if there's some sort of energy field within the building that's so painful, you just have to get away from it. Then suddenly they're out the window and like, how did I get here?
So NIST counted 104 jumpers from all the video and photo evidence that they looked at, but they also stated that the number must have been much higher because not all of them were captured on camera. And without speculating, you can see that something is causing them to jump out the window. It's not a normal situation.
Why are they jumping?
The witness accounts and some of the evidence seem to show that these people were being irradiated with some kind of energy. And a likely candidate is some form of microwave energy, whereby the flesh in these people was being heated up to such an extent that they were jumping out.
You heard of active denial system? I'm not saying that's what this is, but just as a parallel. It's a microwave, they put it for crowd control. And it makes you think that you're burning up, so you just have to get out of there. You just leave no matter what. You don't think about it. So maybe some people were jumping from that. I don't know if that's what it was, but it's consistent with something like that going on inside the building, but not outside the building. And we do know the building was turning to dust inside for the hour before its demise. So I wanted to see how far up the dust went, and then I looked at some weather satellite maps, and I saw this. Hurricane Aaron. It's a Category 3 hurricane that was heading towards New York City for 4 days prior to 9/11. It had been around for a lot longer than that, but it made a beeline to New York City for 4 days straight. What is really weird is that we didn't really hear much about it. How can they be 100% sure when and where that thing's going to turn around? A flight attendant who flew out of Boston that morning contacted me after he saw this on my website and said, "We never were told about that. Flight attendants weren't even told about it."
Now, the unusual thing is that on the 12th of September, it made a right-hand turn of about 135 degrees and headed off out towards Newfoundland. And during the events of 9/11, between about 8 a.m. in the morning and 5 p.m., it held its position. The atmospheric pressure remained constant. The temperature and wind speed remained almost constant right throughout the events of 9/11. Not only that, readings from magnetometers, which are instruments which measure the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, showed unusual variations in the Earth's magnetic field, again, throughout the events of 9/11. David Hansher, the photographer, one of the photographers for the New York Daily News, he reported being levitated, and he was carried a block.
As I hit the corner of Liberty Street, it was almost being picked up by a tornado. Almost being picked up
like a wave.
It was like being picked up
with the black cloud.
That black cloud had substance. It was like night, but it had a solid feel to it. It was like gravel, and just picked me up and tossed me about a block. At one second I was running, and the next second I was airborne. And I lost my glasses, I lost my cell phone, I lost my pager, but managed to hold on to both cameras.
But it threw you for a block?
I was back down at Ground Zero last week and walked the area where I have a pretty good recollection of where I was and where I wound up, and it was just under a city block.
We also have cars. Some of them nearby were also inverted, turned upside down. So again, these accounts, these events, and this evidence must be accounted for.
And then the wind, a very, very fierce wind, and my helmet started lifting me up off the ground. I wasn't sure what was going on. I thought the building might be coming down, and I figured, okay, this could be it, you know. I mean, and I was a little angry. I got, you know, it was like, damn it, like, why me? Why, you know, I'm beautiful. I'm going to die in the World Trade Center on a beautiful summer morning. It's like a little denial and disbelief sets in, and so then I started getting hit with stuff. You know, it was just debris was hitting me, and I'm like amazed now. It's a 110-story building above us, and I'm looking up at the sun.
Fuming from Ground Zero was visible for days, months, and even years after 9/11. NASA thermal imaging shows that the fires were out and temperatures were no longer hot by September 23, 2001. What can cause long-term fuming without generating significant heat?
At dead of night on America's Remembrance Day, stilled for the first time since the rescue work began 2 months ago, even now there is a sense of awesome, gruesome power. Only the hoses continue to try to damp the continuous fires beneath. The grappler creeps as deep as it dares and lugs at still steaming steel bramble, lifts it then to higher ground for yet another grappler to bash it into shape, and lift it again into a waiting truck. And in this hour, this is happening in 50 spots across the site.
They identified 4 classes of particles in the World Trade Center air samples that have been named by the EPA as likely to harm human health. They found fine and very fine transition metals, acids, in this case sulfuric acid, very fine undissolvable particles, in this case glass, which traveled through the lungs to the bloodstream and the heart, and high temperature organic matter, many components of which are known to be carcinogens.
More than 10,000 workers at Ground Zero could receive part of a $657 million settlement after they say they were sickened by dust from the destroyed World Trade Center. Some of the cases included a firefighter who died of throat cancer and another needing a lung transplant.
Let's look at some of the samples that were collected from the WTC. You have a variety of all sorts of strange things in the air. And if you look at the boiling temperatures of these things, there's no rhyme nor reason to the amount of the quantity. It isn't that the things that boil at a lower temperature are more prevalent.
A substance called tritium, which is a form of hydrogen like a gas, was found in water from World Trade Center 6 at 50 times the normal level. Now, this indicates that there was some type of nuclear process or nuclear reaction going on. And this has actually led people like Dmitry Karlazov and Heinz Pomner, Jim Fetzer and others to state that nuclear explosions were used to destroy the World Trade Center. But clearly we can see from the videos that this does not make sense because there were no bright flashes. There was very little noise, certainly not a level of noise commensurate with the scale of the destruction. These were 2 of the tallest buildings in the world.
A lot of folks say a nuke was used on 9/11. Well, do you think they could have kept Chernobyl a secret? People all the way around the world measured the fallout from that. If there was some kind of a regular nuke used in Manhattan on 9/11, do you think they could have kept that a secret? But here we don't find any of the ionizing radiation that you get with nuclear reactions.
At Texas A&M, a group led by Professor John Bockrath, who is widely regarded as one of the world's greatest electrochemists, reported finding the hydrogen isotope tritium, a key signature that some unusual nuclear reaction was going on.
The first thing was this
this thing called tritium, which was a sub-form of hydrogen which should not exist except in extremely tiny quantities. We found that by working these cells of Fleischmann and Pons containing lithium hydroxide and deuterium oxide, that we could produce this tritium in great abundance, let's say at 10,000 times more than it ought to be there, as it were.
Let's assume you're at a conference, speaking before a crowd of people about this. Where did the towers go? And one person raises his or her hand and says, Dr. Wood, can you tell us exactly what happened? What would your answer be?
Well, I can show that the material came apart. It didn't slam to the ground, didn't burn up, don't have anything hitting something, so you can rule out as the cause, the destructive mechanism, you can rule out kinetic energy and you can rule out thermal energy being the causes. Well, as for any conventional weapon, that eliminates anything.
It was in November 2007 that Dr. Wood and I started to discuss something called the Hutchison effect. Now, the Hutchison effect is quite unfamiliar to many people, but John Hutchison, who created the original effect back in the 1980s, is quite well known, and there are many YouTube videos of him and about him if you want to go and look for those. And he actually collected together ex-military equipment, for example, radar equipment, microwave generators, signal generators, and he also used a radioactive source from time to time. And he was able to, over a period of about 10 years, create some unusual effects, such as the warping of metals. He was able to bend copper and steel bars, and he's got pictures of these. In fact, he's generated over 500 pounds of metal samples. I know somebody who's analysed these samples independently as well. So these effects are real. And even people from the Pentagon actually employed John for a period of time. Colonel John Alexander, who at the time was working for Los Alamos National Laboratories, went and spent 4 months with John in 1983 to look at the experiments he was doing.
You write in your book Reality Denied about some experiences that were technically considered failures, but that you believe had a lot of merit to them. One of them you refer to known as the Hutchison effect.
Yep. That was one that is really highly controversial. It began, George Hathaway and another Canadian had shown us a film of some things that looked really, really strange. We had items that were levitating, accelerating, burning. One of the problems was the range of effects.
Yeah.
So in that case, I actually paid them to recreate the situation. Mm-hmm. And actually, he had discovered a number of these things kind of spontaneously.
But the U.S. military took an interest.
Well, we did for a while. The problem, frankly, is control. Mm-hmm. You cannot control the effects, but they're certainly interesting. For instance, they showed me he had a crankshaft. Remember, he's grabbing crap, literally out of the junkyard.
Yeah.
And had exposed to it. They took it to BC Hydro for testing. And the same piece of metal on one end is case hardened steel, on the other end is soft as lead. Uh-huh. And it just from being exposed to things. Mm-hmm. We had PVC that literally was pulverized and disappeared. Another one, they took a rat tail file, put it between two wooden boards, put it in there. It lit up just like, remember the old incandescent light bulbs? Sure. We have a wire across there, and just like that, it lights up. Got to the point the whole file, which is as big as my finger, just lit up and broke apart.
Split in two.
The interesting piece was, as it had been white hot, they reached in and picked it up, and it was cold.
That was pretty risky.
Yes.
It appears that these effects were known to people at Los Alamos as early as 1983. In other words, this strange warping of metal, the levitation effects, which John was creating sporadically. Initially, John was not able to create these effects reliably, but as he worked on this and worked out how to tune his equipment, he was able to create effects very quickly within a few minutes. And we have done several interviews with John where he talks about his work and research. And in 2007, Dr. Judy Wood filed a court case, and John Hutchison submitted an affidavit in Dr. Wood's court case.
Upon examination of the destructive effects done to the World Trade Center on 9/11, as documented by Dr. Judy Wood and as reviewed by me, I can and do assert that the World Trade Center was destroyed by devices that are scaled up, refined, and or weaponized versions of the effects that I have named the Hutchison effect. Levitation of heavy objects, the spontaneous fracturing of metals, changes in the crystalline structure and physical properties of metals, fusion of dissimilar materials such as metal and wood while lacking any displacement, the anomalous heating of metals without burning adjacent material, and the disappearance of metal samples. I have witnessed the tops of steel bars turn to dust and white powders as well as chrome plating being blown off other samples. In the years from and after 1979, many members of the so-called and aptly named military-industrial complex have visited my lab, corresponded with me, and or in a variety of other respects, observed my work and my inventions.
NIST produced 10,000 pages of technical reports about the destruction of the World Trade Center, right? Two companies that were involved in the production of those reports are Science Applications International Corporation and Applied Research Associates. They do research and development in, guess what, directed energy weapons, yet they helped write the NIST reports. You can go on, again, research that further. There is some group stopping us from having free energy. We need to be aware of that. I don't know who they are, but this is very important that we're aware of it and we map them out if we want to move this forward. This is something that people don't talk about a lot. And Eisenhower, as I started off the presentation, he knew this. He knew this 50 years ago.
We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
So there's this Canadian scientist named George Hathaway, and he was at John Hutchison's lab a lot throughout the years, documenting his experiments on video camera. He wrote a book about them, and in John's affidavit, he talks about how George told him that him and Alex Sherezky, while they were working at a lab at 13th Street, they disappeared most of the building above them and shocked the insurance company that came by the next day.
Oddly enough, some of these things actually did happen. We had a whole building disappear in 1987 when I was with
What?
them. I'm not kidding.
A whole building.
I did not see it myself. It was my workers there who worked with Boeing. An insurance agent was to come down to insure the laboratory.
Right.
And basically he came down and found no building, just an empty lot.